Good morning, everybody. As the country expanded in the 1850s and 1860s, there was building pressure on Congress to do something to unite the two coasts. So the Transcontinental Railroad plan was hatched, and it came to its fruition on this date, May 10, 1869, Promontory Summit, Utah Territory, with the driving of the Golden Spike. As you can tell from this map, before 1850, most of our railroad mileage was east of the Mississippi. But as people moved west, there was growing pressure to expand the railroad system. So this was the plan for what led to the Golden Spike. The Union Pacific would go west from Omaha. The Central Pacific would go east from Sacramento. So the Union Pacific had the easier time in that the land was flat through the prairie, but they often ran out of wood for railroad ties, so they would send guys up into the mountains where the forests were to cut railroad ties. The Central Pacific had a shorter distance but harder because they had to go through that granite of the Sierra Nevada. And here you can tell from this old railroad tunnel how they used black powder to blast. Sometimes they even used nitroglycerin, but it was really, really hard work. But eventually they met on this date, May 10, 1869. Here's the famous photograph taken at Promontory Summit in Utah, where the two railroads met and the Golden Spike was driven. Another spike was driven too that actually connected two telegraph wires, which was cool. And this is the Golden Spike. It's at the Museum of Stanford University. Leland Stanford was one of the big guys behind the railroad project. A few years ago, Dorothy and I were in Utah, and we went out to Promontory when we found them doing a reenactment, and they needed somebody to do the telegraph. So here I am with a cool hat and a telegraph key and a script, ready to send the message to President Grant that the Golden Spike has been driven and the nation is united. So that was kind of fun. But how do you get the railroads to build track in open, empty country like the Great Plains? And that was a big issue. So what the government did is it gave land to all the great railroads. And here you can see the railroad map of a few years later. And that checkerboard stands for the land that was given to the railroads to do with what they wanted, to develop it or sell it. So that was an incentive to them. But not all railroads made it. Here's empty track in the middle of nowhere. A lot of railroads failed. A lot of mergers, a lot of bankruptcies in those decades after the Civil War. And if you go out there, you can still see reminders of where the railroad had been. A lot of the track got moved as they found flatter places or easier places. Now this is in Wyoming. It's a monument to the Ames Shovel Company. Ames shovels were used to build the railroad, and people liked them so much they built this monument. But eventually they moved the track, so now this monument is sitting there, but there's not a train within miles. Cornelius Vanderbilt was the big railroad millionaire. He's in that same field or category as John D. Rockefeller of Standard Oil or J.P. Morgan of banking. And one thing Vanderbilt did was adopt steel rails. He was one of the first to do this in a big way. Steel was much better than iron. So Vanderbilt really pushed that. He also adopted the air brake by Westinghouse, which made trains a lot safer. Trains were really, really dangerous in those early days. And everybody liked the Pullman car pictured here. George Pullman came up with a luxury way to travel on the railroads. So this chart reminds us how the iron and steel industry grew in our country. Trains need steel to be made, but they also ship it. So there was a relationship between trains and the growth of industry that was really, really important. Now, the same year as the Golden Spike, the Suez Canal was dug, pictured here, connecting the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. And 2 years after this, Jules Verne wrote Around the World in 80 Days, in which the Transcontinental Railroad and the Suez Canal play a role. So suddenly the world is a lot smaller.